This afternoon, I'd like to talk about teaching and learning classical languages because one of the things modern education has done is made us all feel like we can't learn anything unless we enroll in a course, pay tuition, and so on. And very few people do any real studies outside of a paid school environment. And these studies are actually very, very simple if we just take some time to learn how to go about them. And I'd like to explain to you how you can learn Latin and Greek so that you can read them and make use of them in the 21st century in your everyday life as a Christian. The biggest obstacle to the classical languages is that they've been part of modern school and college programs for several generations, and they don't belong in modern schools or modern colleges. And what's offered in the name of classical language education is really terrible. For example, when I was at Rutgers University as a classics student, even in the classics department, my Latin course was taught by a graduate student who was assigned to teach this class. And I'm not boasting when I say this, but halfway through the semester, I knew the material better than she did. In fact, one class, she asked me to come up to the board and explain a lesson on participles because she was struggling. And that's the kind of low quality, lack of attention that's given to the actual teaching of the classical languages. It's just assumed that you can just go read the book and figure it out and then get your credits, and that's all that matters. But if you really want to know the languages, if you really want to know Latin and Greek, how should you study them? My first recommendation is that you not pay tuition anywhere, because there's no place that's going to give you good instruction in the classical languages that's worth paying for. If you did find a good Latin or Greek teacher, what he would teach you is something that you could practice on your own. You wouldn't need to pay tuition. You wouldn't need any kind of expensive study materials. It just comes down to effort and time. You have to work hard for an extended period of time to learn the language. So the first thing is, don't waste any money. Don't start by spending. That's the worst thing you can do. There's basically, I would say, two things that you need to do to learn the classical languages. And if you learn Latin in the right way, which I'd recommend first, if you learn Latin in the right way, you can very quickly learn Greek. And here's what I would recommend. This is what I actually do with students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. First of all, you're going to have to learn some grammar. You're going to have to study the grammar of the language. But again, if you take a modern Latin grammar book, what modern education loves to do is pretend that an interest in detail and completeness from the beginning is a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of expertise. For a teacher on the first day of class to start rambling about obscure exceptions to rules and details that 99% of those students would never encounter in any of their reading. We imagine that the knowledge of the exceptions and obscure grammatical details is a sign of how smart we are, and that stuff is crammed into the beginning of books. Modern academics loves to show off and try to appear smart by talking about obscurities. What they don't focus on is the common rules, common things, the simple forms and common grammar that students are actually going to experience and need to know for the majority of the readings that they're going to experience and look at in their actual studies. So you need to have a good grammar textbook. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what I use is the old Jesuit textbook on Latin grammar that was written by the Jesuit priest Emmanuel Alvarez. This textbook is important because it was written for students in the Jesuit schools. And so it's written from the perspective of a responsible teacher, not a guy who's trying to show off his mastery of the obscurities and impress his academic friends. It's written to teach children in a way that's most useful. Now, one thing worth noting is that the original grammar of Alvarez that Alvarez wrote was criticized by the Jesuit leaders back in the 1500s, and they created a revised edition that was called the Roman Method. And this made Alvarez's text even more friendly for the students. And if you go to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, what you'll find there is that I actually use that Roman method of the Alvarez grammar in my Latin grammar course. The problem with Alvarez's text for new students who don't have a teacher is that it's written in Latin. And that seems sort of strange that you would write a book in the language that's being studied, but it was assumed in that context that there was a teacher and that he was a master of the Latin language. So in the academy, I actually do the work of the teacher and translate Alvarez's grammar and explain all of his lessons and rules. But those lessons are freely accessible on the website with my translation and explanation. So you can study Alvarez's grammar. That's all available for free. So I recommend that. I recommend that you study on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website and study. Find the Latin grammar course on the side menu under Trivium. Open up the Latin Grammar 1 course and study the grammar of Emmanuel Alvarez. You'll notice if you look on that course page that there are lessons or chapters in Alvarez's textbook that are skipped. It's important for us to understand in the 21st century that there's no reason for us to learn to speak or compose in Latin. If you wanted to pursue that knowledge, you could do so using Alvarez's text. If you're interested in reading and interpreting the sacred scripture in the Vulgate or the writings of the Latin church fathers and doctors like Thomas Aquinas or all of the Latin literature that's available, you don't need to study every chapter in Alvarez's grammar, and really it would be a waste of time. And I'll give you an example. For example, if you wanted to compose and speak in true Latin, I don't mean fake Latin that's made up for school use, which is silly. It's like Spanglish in Spanish class. I mean real Latin. If we were going to speak in Latin, you would need to learn to speak real Latin. If you wanted to do that, and again, I think that this is really ridiculous in modern schools, but you would have to be able to figure out the gender of any noun that you were going to use in your speech. You'd have to be able to know the gender, because you'd have to make sure that the gender of a participle or a pronoun or an adjective agreed with the noun, the substantive noun. So you'd have to know rules of gender. If you're concerned with studying and reading and translating Latin, you don't need to learn those rules, because the translation work works in the opposite direction. You go from the Latin to the English, the grammar is already present in the form and known. But in composition, you have to be able to know on the spot the gender of a noun for the sake of the other parts of speech. And that's why if you look at that course, you'll see that lessons are skipped, and we move quickly and efficiently through the course as students who are interested in reading and translation, not in composition. But you're welcome to study those lessons in Latin Grammar 1, and they'll help you to quickly and efficiently learn the grammar in an orderly way so as to help you get reading with understanding. Once you've completed the first lesson or two, so that you can read and pronounce the words correctly, that's taught right up in the beginning. That's the first part of Latin grammar. It's called orthography, learning the letters and the pronunciation of Latin. Once you learn that, you're ready to start reading. And then I'd recommend that you study the lessons in my Latin reading course on the Academy website. In Latin reading, what we do, we don't start with fake exercises like all the textbooks. They have artificial sentences to read. And it's just ridiculous, because if your teacher doesn't lead you to just read real Latin, what in the world is he teaching you? I once visited with a priest at a monastery who wanted to get together and talk about classical studies. So I took a ride out and visited him for a week. And we met every day and talked for a little while about classical studies. And he was frustrated because he had been studying Latin for 10 years or so. And he said he would pick up writings of Latin church fathers and he couldn't read them. He couldn't understand the Latin, and he didn't understand why, after so many years of Latin studies, he couldn't read a Latin author. And the reason I told him was because he didn't learn Latin. That's why. You learn something called Latin, but the fact that you pick up a book and can't read it is proof that what you're learning may be called Latin, but it's obviously not Latin. And that's very common today. Many students in classics departments or in schools, they study something called Latin, a subject called Latin for years and years, but if you were to hand them a book written in Latin, they have no idea what it says. Just imagine how ridiculous that would be if we did that in English. Imagine if we were in China and there was someone there who said that he was teaching the students English. And we visited and we handed his students, who were paying him to teach them English. Imagine if we handed them an English book and said, "Can you read this?" And they looked at it and said they had no idea what it said. We'd be suspicious, wouldn't we? But today, teachers in classical languages get away with that. And we just imagine that, man, these languages must be so difficult to read because we study and we can never read anything. But that's just proof that what's being taught is a bunch of jibber jabber. And the teachers really don't know the language. And in our generation, it's easy to make money teaching Latin and Greek because no one can hold you accountable. But anyway, what we do in the academy is we start with the Gospel of St. John, and we just read it and translate it. And I teach the students the meaning and grammar of every single word that we see. And we just start with verse 1. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. We read the Latin, we practice pronunciation, and then we go word by word, and I explain what it means to the students. In, the first word, is a preposition. It's followed by a noun that's going to be in the ablative or the accusative case. The preposition in can mean in or into or to. The exact meaning of that preposition is determined by the noun that follows it. In the case of that noun, and we look and we see we have in principio. So it's an ablative noun. Students won't understand that yet because they're just getting started with their grammar, but I explain it to them in advance. Principio is a noun in the ablative case, and it means the beginning. So in principio means in the beginning. And then we move on. In principio erat verbum. Erat is a verb. The tense it's a past tense verb. It's an imperfect tense verb. And it means was. So in the beginning was, and then the next word is verbum. Verbum is a noun that means the word. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the word. And we just move like that very simply through the first 4 chapters or so of the Gospel of St. John, reading the Latin. And that's what we do in Latin Reading 1. Now, the method that we use in this study is referred to as a Ciceronian method because Cicero actually taught it and explained it in his writings when he was explaining how to study Greek. I mean, he was a Roman speaker, so obviously learning Latin was not a concern for him, but to be educated in Roman society meant that you were fluent in Greek and could read Greek. So in explaining how to study Greek, he taught a method of translation that was his method of learning a foreign language. And we simply take that method, which was used all through the Middle Ages. For example, you can look up a book by a writer named Ascham. I think his first name is Roger Ascham, Ascham. And the name of his book was The Schoolmaster, spelled Schole. It looks like Schoolmaster, but it's Schoolmaster. And he teaches that same method in that book. I think it was published in the 1400s. And that method was used all through the Middle Ages to teach the classical languages, really to teach any language. It's why the Jesuit missionaries in the 15 and 1600s were able to go into countries and so quickly learn their languages because they knew the method for studying and learning a new language. It was that Ciceronian method that they always used. So we use that in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And what we'll do is we translate and we study the language and learn the language by translation. So what we'll do is we'll take, as I said, the first verse of the Gospel of St. John, and we'll learn the translation from Latin into English. And then what the students will do is they'll practice writing out, they'll write out the Latin, and then they'll write out the translation word for word. Word for word. There's no guessing at the ideas or using your prior knowledge of the language to guess at translations. The translation has to be word for word from Latin into English. And they work on that until they can do that without any help. They can write out the Latin text and write out the translation word for word. And then what they do is they write out the English translation. So they would have in principio erat verbum from verse 1, and they would write out the English translation. In the beginning was the Word. And then what they do is they write the English translation, in the beginning was the Word, and they turn it from English back into Latin. And if they get it right, they can compare it to the original Latin text from St. Jerome, and they'll see that they have it exactly right. The spelling is right, the endings are right, the words that they choose are right, and they'll continue going back and forth from Latin to English and from English to Latin until they can do that in both directions perfectly from memory without any help. And so they can go from Latin to English and from English to Latin, and once they master verse 1, we move on to verse 2. And in every lesson of our Latin Reading 1 course, we go through 5 verses. So we do 5 verses every lesson. And we move like that, one word at a time, with me providing all the details that the students need to learn the translation word by word. And we do that through 3 or 4, maybe even 5 chapters of the Gospel of St. John. By the time they're through that much of the Gospel of St. John, they should have moved along pretty well through the grammar book, at least through the first part of Alvarez's grammar, which is the study of etymology, or all of the forms of the parts of speech. And they're ready to move in grammar, they're ready to move into syntax, which is the next part, the third part of Latin grammar, which is studied in Latin Grammar 2 in the Academy. And when they're at that point, when they're ready to start studying syntax and they've moved through the first 4 chapters of the Gospel of St. John in that translation work, we're ready for level 2. And in level 2, their grammar studies move up to Latin Grammar 2, where they study Latin syntax, or the rules for sentences and composition. And we move from the Gospel of St. John, which is easy, because for most Catholic students it should be familiar, at least the content and the vocabulary should be familiar. And we move into a Latin reading that's no longer familiar to them. We study the Epistles of Cicero, and the students are unfamiliar with the content of these epistles, and so what happens is they continue in those same translation exercises, but using a text that they're not familiar with, and it forces them to rely much more on their vocabulary and on their knowledge of the grammar. And that's the point. That's why we move from the Gospel of St. John to the Epistles of Cicero. So that's level 2. And then level 3, when they've learned syntax and they've become comfortable with Cicero's Latin, then we move to level 3, which in grammar is the study of prosody, which has to do with accent, pronunciation, and meter. And once we get into meter and accent, we're ready to study Latin poetry. And so in Latin Reading 3, we continue the same translation exercises, but we move from the writings of Cicero, which are prose writings, we move into Latin poetry, and we study Virgil's Aeneid. Same method of translation, Latin into English, English into Latin, word by word, no moving words around like students are taught in modern schools. They're taught to scan the sentence and find the noun and then find, no, that's not how the language works. That's not how the language works. You translate word by word just as a Roman would have heard the language spoken. And so we learn to translate, and we just continue into Latin poetry, studying Virgil's Aeneid. In Latin, the students have to be able to read the poem and understand the meter of the poem, how poetry affects the syntax and arrangement of the sentences. There's much more looseness, so words can be all over the place, and the students have to have a very flexible sense and understanding of the language so that they can translate things when words may be lacking, and they have to know how to continue translating word for word, maintaining the meter and proper pronunciation of the poem, while also allowing the full sentence to come together over a much longer period in poetry. And so they learn that in Latin grammar 3 and Latin reading 3. And that's how we study the Latin language. Notice that from the very beginning, it's reading real Latin text. There's no fake Latin. None of this modern nonsense. In modern circles, I hear things that just make me cringe, to hear somebody say, hey, you can start our Latin program and you don't even need to know any Latin. If you're spending money on study materials where the people tell you you don't need to know Latin to learn Latin, you have to realize that you're getting fleeced. Of course a teacher has to know the language in order to lead a student to mastery in it. And what those publishers usually do is they just dumb down and water down the program, and they publish all kinds of workbooks and stuff that draws out the lessons that could take kids a couple of days. They water them down and draw them out so that they take whole years to work through these silly workbooks. And the kids never progress anywhere. I mean, show me fluent Latin readers that have come from those workbook programs. Our kids are reading Latin from day one, and they quickly become able to read and translate. By the time we're into John chapter 2 and into chapter 3, I mean, there's less and less unfamiliar vocabulary, more and more familiar expressions and grammatical forms, and it just gets faster and faster. No one would ever teach a foreign language the way we see these Latin homeschool programs teaching it who actually knew the language. It's so slow and boring. No person fluent in a language would ever teach a language like that. And our program with translation, you're in real Latin translation from day one. It's fun. It's like a puzzle. And plus the lessons just guide you word by word. So all you have to do, as I said in the beginning of this video, all you need to do is put in the time and effort, and you're going to be translating. And you learn how to translate. You learn how the language works. And so if you were to take another book, like I mentioned before when that priest who I visited with told me he couldn't read different works when he wanted to, and he didn't understand why. If you've done a lot of translation work and you've been taught how to translate, how to read the language, anytime you move to a new author or a new book, the language is not going to change, the grammar is not going to change. There may simply be new vocabulary. And so that's not a big deal. If someone were to hand me a book from an author that I had never read before, on a subject that I had never studied before. For example, let's say someone gave me a Latin book that was written about a topic that I've never studied. A Latin book about the geography of some, let's say, Asian country. Well, I wouldn't be familiar with the vocabulary, all the place names and things like that. I would have no way to know. I would have to look those things up. I'd have to look up the vocabulary, but the language itself would be no problem. And that's just normal. Anytime we take up a new author or read in a new subject, there's going to be new vocabulary. But the goal of Latin teaching, and this is important, the goal of Latin teaching is to teach a student to be able to read a language so that the only thing that he ever needs is vocabulary. And that's why if a student is well trained in the language, all he should need is a dictionary. If he's given a Latin book and a dictionary, he should be safe. That's the goal for a teacher, to have students who can read with nothing but a dictionary to help them. Now that's all well and good for Latin, but I said that you can learn Latin and Greek. So what about Greek? How do we learn Greek? Well, the good news is we learn Greek in the same exact way. We learn Greek in the same exact way. And if you've learned Latin using the method that I've explained, it's very easy to learn Greek because it works in the same way. So we would do the same thing. We would start by studying Greek grammar. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I've researched and restored a Greek grammar by another Jesuit grammarian named Jacob Gretzer. That's modeled on the same structure and system that was studied in Alvarez's grammar. So if you're familiar with Alvarez's grammar, you're going to move very quickly through Gretzer's Greek grammar. And that's what we do. So the first challenge in Greek is to learn a different alphabet, which, to be honest, is fun. So we have to learn the Greek alphabet, learn Greek pronunciation. We have to learn to read the Greek accent marks and breathing marks, which takes a lesson or two. And I'm going to be teaching these things through live online classes. So if you'd like to study them with me and in a live online class, just hop in those live online classes. It's going to cost $5 for a class. No big deal. But anyway, you need to learn the alphabet and the pronunciation, and then once you're comfortable with the Latin and the alphabet and pronunciation, you're ready to go. You're ready to start reading. And we do the same thing. We start with the Gospel of St. John, verse 1. En arche ein hologos. We read the Greek text, and what we find is because St. Jerome translated the Greek into Latin, we find that the Latin almost matches the Greek exactly. We already know how to translate the Latin, so the translation of the Greek is actually very, very simple. We can actually translate the Greek into Latin very easily, and most students can do that. But we can also translate the Greek into English very easily. And what's very helpful is we'll see some things in the Greek text that explain some of the difficulties that students have in translating the Latin into English. We see the reasons for different translations when we go to the Greek text, because remember, the Greek text is the actual original text written by St. John. The Latin text is St. Jerome's translation. But if you've learned to translate the Latin Vulgate, translating the original Greek is very, very simple. And so we just eliminate so many unnecessary difficulties and obstacles by studying the classical languages in this way. And then it's just a matter, again, of working through verse by verse, word by word, through the Gospel of St. John, the first 4 or 5 chapters. We stop there. We stop after 4 chapters or so, because by the time we get to chapter 4, the students are so comfortable with the vocabulary and the reading that there's almost no challenge anymore when we get to a new set of verses. And so we get to a point where our vocabulary plateaus and really doesn't increase much anymore, and that's when it's time to move on to a new author, new topic. Now, in Greek, we move from the Gospel of St. John into a classical author, just as we do in Latin. The classical author that we study is Aristotle, because in our studies, in our classical curriculum, we're going to spend a lot of time in Aristotle, so it's good for us to move on and learn to translate, become familiar with the style and vocabulary of Aristotle. So we study Aristotle in Greek reading 2. We move on to Greek syntax and Gretzer's grammar in Greek grammar 2. And then when we continue on into Greek Grammar 3, we study Greek prosody, which is, again, in Gretzer's grammar book, because it's written just like Alvarez's grammar. We move from the prose writing of Aristotle, and we spend some time in the prose writing of Plato, because learning to read the dialogues is obviously helpful. And then we move into Greek reading 3, where we again study poetry, and we learn to read Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, just as we read Virgil's Aeneid in Latin reading 3. So the method is very simple. All of our time is spent in real Latin and Greek reading, and because we learn Latin in the right way, using the right method, it makes for our study of Greek to be very efficient and simple. And in both languages, from day one, we're reading real texts, no fake school Latin, no fake school Greek. We read real Latin and Greek, and within a few years, by the time kids are finished with their studies in the academy, there's no reason why they're not fluent readers in Latin and Greek. And again, as Christians, our goal is to be able to read and interpret the languages. We're not interested in composition. So, that's my advice for how to study classical Latin and Greek. All of this is available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and as I said, you can get this study started, and you can pursue this study on your own if you want, for free, if you're willing to work and be patient. But in the academy, we charge for enrollment, and what enrollment means is you simply get assistance from us. You get live chat support, assessments, you get grading for assignments and things like that. So it may be of interest to you as an adult student, if you'd like to study the languages, to go ahead and enroll. You can also participate in live online classes. We charge per class because you can pick which classes you'd like to participate in, and if there's a class that doesn't look interesting to you, you can just skip it and not worry about it. So we offer academic services to help with your studies, but if you're gifted intellectually and willing to put in the time and effort, you can make your way through those online curriculum materials on your own. And if you have questions, obviously, I'm happy to help. If you're working independently, you can always contact me with questions. But I invite you and encourage you to take up the study of the classical languages. Don't be discouraged if you've had bad experiences in modern schools where you've tried to study the classical languages, especially if you tried to do so in a modern college and just found the Latin or Greek grammar course to be boring and confusing, and the readings to be boring, and the teachers pull readings from all different sources, and it's just a mess. It makes no sense why they're doing that. They're not following any tradition in teaching like that. I don't think many teachers really know how to teach the languages. And to be honest, I don't believe that many people who do translation work are real masters of the language. You can look at the translations and just see that no one who knows the original language would ever think that this or that is a good translation. I'm talking about books like the Loeb Classics, where we have the Latin and Greek texts, and then we have English translations. There are times where I look at the English and I have no idea what the translator was thinking. And it's no wonder that kids struggle to read, not even the original language, but the English, because the translations are often very poor, very confusing. As Catholics, we have so many benefits because we have such a rich history of language studies, commentaries, translations. All these things are so helpful that we really should be the world leaders in classical studies and classical languages. But because of laziness and worldly anxieties, Catholics don't study these things. And even worse, I think, because of bad experiences in modern schools, Catholics just think that these studies aren't worth pursuing because they're too difficult. But if a 4-year-old kid could learn to speak Latin, it can't be that complicated. And if a 5-year-old kid could learn to speak Greek, it can't be that complicated. Something has to be wrong that's preventing people from learning these languages. And my argument would be it's the method. The teachers aren't following the advice and methods that were used by the masters themselves and commended to us as the best methods. They don't follow the counsel of the wise men of the past, and so they do their own thing, and the results are what we should expect. Now, as for all of these recommendations, obviously you can pursue them all in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I would love for you to do that. As for other programs, if you wanted to know, like, well, what about this program? What about this program? The most popular in private circles and in a lot of modern schools is the Lingua Latina program. The Lingua Latina program claims that you can learn Latin without any English. And so it boasts about, from day one, you dive into the Latin language and you start with these basic sentences like Roma in Italia est. And because it's so simple, you really don't even need any English. You can just look at the map and you can kind of figure out what the Latin says, even though you're still thinking in English, so it really is not a big deal anyway. The problem with this, there's two main problems with Lingua Latina. First of all, we don't need to learn how to speak in Latin. That whole thing, I don't know, I think it attracts people who want to try to show off and pretend that they're intellectual by being able to say things in Latin. But as I said, when there's no one around to actually hold anyone accountable to real Latin, it's just silly. It's like, I call it Georgie Porgy academics. Georgie Porgy is out with the girls out in the playground, and he can act tough because the boys aren't out. But then if the boys came out, Georgie Porgy would run away. And we have this sort of fake Georgie Porgy academic culture where all these people pretend like they're experts, but there's no one present to examine them. And so they're just allowed to get away with this act of speaking in Latin. We don't need to speak in Latin. So that's my first objection to the use of Lingua Latina. The benefit that it claims to offer us is not needed. We don't need to speak Latin. Secondly, and more importantly, with the Lingua Latina program, you may learn a lot of Latin, but it's not going to transition into Greek. There may be a Greek program that goes along with it, I'm not sure. But the method of the Jesuit grammar textbooks and the Ciceronian translation method is just way better if you want to study both classical languages. And you can continue in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you can continue with the same method into Biblical Hebrew. So the benefit of one program over another, if you just compare one against one, well, you can argue about which is better, but that's really not where the argument is. The question is, which method of study will help me learn all the classical languages, or all the sacred languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew? Which can I also use to learn Italian and French and Spanish or German? And the answer is the method that we use in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I just started posting lessons for Spanish, for example, that use the same method so students can quickly start learning Spanish. I'm going to do the same thing for French and Italian and any other language we want because it applies to all languages. So that would be my main criticism for why students shouldn't pursue Lingua Latina or other isolated programs that are just all over the place. We want to learn all the languages, not just one. And we don't want to have to learn a different method every time we'd like to learn a new language. There's no need for that. The Jesuits, because of their missionary work, they were so good at efficiently learning and teaching languages, and we can benefit from that. And that's the method we use in the academy. And just to burst the bubble of those who like to brag about lingua Latina, when I told the story before about the priest who had studied Latin for 10 years and was supposedly, according to his own opinion, he was fluent in speaking Latin. He couldn't read real Latin texts. And so, that's the risk of these, living Latin programs, is that the teachers and the students are not accountable to real Latin, and will find that they struggle to read the languages when they're presented with texts that contain real Latin. So I wouldn't recommend lingua Latina. Obviously, if I thought lingua Latina was effective, I would have used it. But the most effective method, the method recommended by Cicero, who's the master of the Latin language, for studying Greek, is the method that we use in the academy, and I recommend it to everyone because anyone can use it. And like I said, it's fun. The translation work is fun. You can look back and see yourself progressing. It gets easier and easier every lesson, and we progress from Christian readings into classical readings and then into poetry. And that's really what we need to do if we're going to be able to read and use Latin, especially if you're thinking about liturgical uses of the languages. For example, to sing Latin hymns. Latin hymns are all examples of Latin poetry. If you don't get to Latin prosody, you're not going to be able to understand or translate a Latin hymn because it's a poem. When the Benedictines, just as a side note here, when the Benedictines worked to restore Gregorian Chant a generation or so ago, it was explained that for the right understanding of Gregorian Chant, one didn't need to know music theory, modern music theory. One didn't need to be a musician. It was explained that what was needed for a true understanding of Gregorian Chant was mastery of Latin prosody, actual Latin grammar. So there are just so many benefits of studying the classical languages in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I don't mean to boast when I say we know what we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's all based on historic textbooks and methods and writings of schoolmasters from the past, and I believe it's the most efficient method. Whether you're a student being homeschooled, studying the classical languages, whether you're a parent who'd like to learn the classical languages, or just an adult who wants to become fluent in reading classical Latin and Greek for your own Catholic life and use. I think the Latin grammar and Latin reading and Greek grammar and Greek reading courses that we offer in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy are the best. And so you're welcome to use them for free if you want to study independently. If you'd like to make use of our academic services, you can go ahead and enroll. So I hope that's helpful, an overview of how I'd recommend studying classical Latin and Greek. If you have any any specific questions, please contact me. I'm happy to help you understand how to get started with your studies. And if you get started, I'm happy to help you along the way. Just stay in touch. God bless.